Imaginative guitarist-writer seeks involvement with receptive musicians determined to strive beyond existing, stagnant music forms. That was the ad that a young guitarist put into Melody Maker magazine in December of 1970. One could say that he was looking for a more progressive sound. The late 60s were a breeding ground of bands that were searching for something different, more adventurous, and classically influenced pieces of music that rose above the simple chord progressions of rock and roll. Bands like Procol Harum, Jethro Tull, King Crimson, the Moody Blues, and many others began a new wave of experimentation and enhanced musicianship. The guitarist we're going to look at today was at the crest of the wave of this musical revolution, in the right place at the right time to drive those stagnant music forms forward. Let's look at progressive rock guitarist Steve Hackett. Welcome once again to Forgotten Fretmasters, where we examine guitarists and musicians who, for one reason or another, might not have been as commercially successful as, had the longevity of, or left us sooner than some of the other guys who often end up on all the top 10 lists. For our fifth episode, we're going to delve into one of my all-time favorite guitarists, Steve Hackett. I got into Genesis at a very young age, and I've continued to be a fan my entire life, so I'm looking forward to bringing this one to you. But first, if you like content like this, please consider subscribing to the Guitar Historian channel for more episodes of Forgotten Fretmasters, as well as many episodes of my other series, If Guitars Could Speak. Also, consider hitting the like button below to let YouTube know that you think other guitar fans would like to see this. Remember, I can't use copyrighted music in my videos, so I've placed a number of links in the description below so that when you're done here, you can go ahead and view some of my favorite performances by Steve. With that, let's get on with it. Stephen Richard Hackett was born in the Pimlico section of London on 12 February 1950 to Peter and June Hackett. In a strange twist, he was born only one day earlier than his future bandmate Peter Gabriel. At one point, the family would move to Vancouver, Canada, but this didn't last long as Steve's mother would become homesick and they would shortly move back to Pimlico. Steve and his little brother John were encouraged to enjoy and pursue music, and by their early teens they were both playing various instruments. Steve wouldn't pick up the guitar until age 12, playing single note lines and working his way up to chords and progressions. His little brother John took up the flute, and he often performed with Steve in the early days, becoming quite a successful and prolific musician in his own right. But although young Steve was influenced by the Beatles and Hendrix, some of his other influences would actually set him apart from his contemporaries. A thorough grounding in the classics such as Bach and opera singer Mario Lanza, coupled with a few names such as Peter Green and Danny Kirwan of Fleetwood Mac and Robert Fripp from King Crimson, already showed a marked departure from guitarists who came earlier. Hackett would be influenced by the first generation of mid-60s guitarists who'd moved past Beatlemania and were pushing the envelope of what the electric guitar could do. Steve's early forays into playing professionally went right into the progressive rock genre, with Hackett joining a few bands over the course of 1968 through 1970. The first band he joined was called Canterbury Glass, and he would perform on one song for their album Sacred Scenes and Characters. This album wouldn't be distributed commercially until 2007. The next two projects that he worked on were with bands Heel Pier and Sarabande, both of which featured prog rock elements but didn't last long. Finally, Steve would fall in with his little brother John in the band Quiet World for their album The Road. Steve would have no artistic influence on the album, as the writers would tell the musicians what to play. It was later in 1970 that Steve would seek a more permanent situation and would place the ad that we talked about at the top of the video in Melody Maker. The ad stood out to the lead singer of a burgeoning progressive rock band called Genesis, who had actually been through a lot in just their first 2 years of existence, including 2 managers, 2 albums, and 2 record companies. Founding member Anthony Phillips, a forgotten fretmaster in his own right, was the previous lead guitarist in the band, but he had started developing crippling stage fright as the band began to grow into its own power, and sadly, Phillips had to step away, and so the search was on. Gabriel reached out to Hackett and asked him to listen to the recent Genesis release Trespass, which featured only 6 songs and ended with the epic live stunner The Knife. Gabriel would later say a lot of the other guitarists were going into, Flash and all that stuff, and Steve was into atmospheres, and that's what attracted us. Steve fit into Genesis right away, and with the addition of a new drummer named Phil Collins, I wonder whatever happened to that guy. The early classic lineup of Genesis was in place. They would enter Trident Studios in August of '71 to record their third album, Nursery Crime. Steve began making his presence felt immediately, playing absolutely scorching runs on songs like The Fountain of Salmacis, The Musical Box, and one of my personal favorites, The Return of the Giant Hogweed. Hackett also pushed for the use of the Mellotron and contributed to the song For Absent Friends, which also featured drummer Phil Collins on vocals for the first time. Hackett found himself in the perfect band to showcase his many talents and interests on the guitar. He was able to show off many varied styles, both acoustically and electrically. His work on the 12th string, sometimes in tandem with stringmate Mike Rutherford, was a massive addition to Genesis's many layers. Hackett would say, "I felt kind of the delicate pastel shading acoustic aspect of the band. It was very good. But then when the band was to sort of rise into an area of some power, I felt that was an area that I warmed to. The fact that there was some aggression in my playing, and I could kind of put that stamp on it in a way." In my humble opinion, Genesis between 1970 and '74 featured the most talented group of musicians of any progressive rock band of the era. The reason they're not always remembered among the other similar bands like Yes, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and Rush is because they lacked one thing: major commercial success. The band would kick out further similar albums to Trespass and Nursery Crime in 1972's Foxtrot and 1973's Selling England by the Pound, the latter of which features what is probably Hackett's most iconic solo with Genesis from the song Firth of Fifth. Hackett used a technique that would come to be known and named as tapping by its most famous proponent, Eddie Van Halen. Hackett tells the story that Eddie directly told him that he was inspired to use the technique from attending a Genesis show in the mid-'70s. He also became an early user of a technique that would come to be known later as sweep picking. In his quest to find more diverse and interesting sounds to fit the atmosphere of whatever song he was working on, Steve has used a lot of effects and pedals over the years. In the early days, he was known to use a gold top Les Paul Deluxe with mini humbuckers and what looked like a black Les Paul Custom. His regular pedal board in those days featured a Color Sound tone bender, a Dunlop Crybaby Wah, and a shallow volume pedal for his trademark swells. He was also known to use a Shaftesbury Duo Fuzz and a Marshall Super Fuzz, among many others. I'll drop a link down below to Steve's own website, which goes over a number of Steve's gear choices, both new and old. Seriously, if I keep listening, the video would probably be an hour long. So, one more important note though, he's been using Fernandez Les Paul copies lately due to a system that gives Steve almost infinite sustain, but back in the old days, he would do it with a good old-fashioned feedback. But what makes Steve Hackett special as a guitarist is his precision. His bends, sweeps, taps, hammers, and pulls, even pick scrapes, have a technicality to them, and he is a great guitarist to show to those younger learners who are starting to master some things. Exposing them to Hackett's playing will teach them that being the fastest and the loudest isn't always what works for the song. Steve's solo on Firth of Fifth is mesmerizing for its sustaining single notes and melodic minimalist bends. But let's be clear, when it came time to play the fast, complicated stuff, he wasn't getting left behind. He could shred with the best of them. The runs in the Musical Box spring to mind. With the arrival of 1974, Genesis began work on their most ambitious project to date, what would become the double album The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Based on a story that Gabriel had written about a young Puerto Rican youth in New York City going through a strange voyage of self-discovery based on myth and drug allegory. But the writing and recording of the album would become a war of attrition for Genesis, with most of the band members going through one personal situation or another. Steve Hackett explained, "Everybody had their own agenda. Some of us were married. Some of us had children. Some of us were getting divorced. And we were still trying to get it together in the country." The country Steve spoke of was the infamous Headley Grange, and Genesis's arrival should have foreshadowed the tension to come. The previous band had left the place in a very poor state with excrement on the floors and a noticeable rat infestation. Nice. Steve was going through a divorce with his first wife at the time, and Gabriel's wife Jill had had a problematic birth with their first child, causing Peter to have to travel back and forth from the studio to home. Mike Rutherford would later say with regret that he felt that he and keyboardist Tony Banks had been, quote, horribly unsupportive to Gabriel at the time. It didn't help the band that Gabriel was basically writing the lyrics as he went, fitting them into the loose jams and musical sections that the band was putting together, sometimes on their own. It became a race to the photo finish, but the album was finally released on time on 22 November 1974, and a massive 102-date tour of Europe and North America was planned. But, of course, to compound the star-crossed bad mojo surrounding the project, Hackett would break a wine glass, causing a gash to his left hand that severed a tendon, and he needed months to recover. The tour was then pushed back, but the band had already paid deposits to venues for bookings, so as a result, Genesis would end up over £200,000 in debt when all was said and done. The Lamb, though joining Genesis's other albums in relative commercial obscurity, has become known as a touchstone in progressive rock with the fantastical and psychedelic themes and unequaled musicianship. But because of the tension and lack of support that he received during his wife's medical issues, Gabriel felt that it was time to leave the band to spend more time with his family. He would tell Genesis in November of 1974 during a stop in Cleveland, but they would keep it a secret for over 6 months, and the story didn't break until August of next year. With Gabriel's departure, Genesis decided to soldier on without him, beginning a search for a new lead singer. But during this relative period of inactivity, Steve decided it was time for him to work on a solo record. Originally titled Premonitions, record label Charisma thought it was too plain and suggested The Voyage of the Acolyte, which, let's be real, is a lot cooler. Rutherford and Phil Collins would both help out on the album, which featured a loose concept with each track being inspired by tarot cards. The album ended up doing pretty well, peaking at number 26 in the UK charts and becoming certified silver. But the most important aspect was the freedom that it gave to Steve to write, record, and produce the album the way he wanted. It would give him a taste of the solo life, and it was a flavor that definitely satisfied him. Meanwhile, Genesis had played an advertisement seeking a lead singer for Genesis-type group, anonymously a melody maker, just a bit before the Gabriel story had broke to the media, and over 400 vocalists would respond to the call. They would work out dozens upon dozens of applicants, with Phil Collins teaching the singers the vocal lines, but as the band began to refine new material for their next album, which would become A Trick of the Tail, none of the singers seemed to work. Frustrated, they would just have Phil record the lead vocals to the song Squonk, and after the performance they decided that their new lead singer was already in the band. As Phil told it later, "I just sang on the album. I was still the drummer who just happened to sing the songs." I think Phil ended up doing okay with that whole singing thing. Anyway, A Trick of the Tail ended up being positively received by critics, who were surprised that the band could not only carry on without Gabriel, but also deliver a well-recorded album full of good songs. It remains my favorite Collins-era Genesis album to this day. They would follow up Tail with a similar but no less interesting release in Wind and Wuthering, and it was after the recording of this album that Steve Hackett would announce his departure from Genesis as well. Tony Banks remembered it as a bit of a surprise, as he felt that Hackett's writing on the album was some of the best and most complete work that he'd done with Genesis. But Steve still felt as though most of his work was being rebuffed by the band. And remember what I said about going solo? Once Hackett had had a taste, there was no going back. Still, feeling restrained and stinging from the rebuke he'd received from Banks and Rutherford, who told him that he could not have a solo career while also being in Genesis, he announced his permanent departure from the group during the mixing stage of Genesis' second live album, Seconds Out, in late 1977. Genesis would go on to release the aptly titled And Then There Were Three in 1978, which included their first hit, Follow You, Follow Me, which would mark a departure and new direction for the group, with the single reaching number 7 in the UK and number 23 in the US. And I think we all know what happened from there. Genesis would enter their most commercially successful period in the early to mid-80s, bolstered no doubt by the concurrent solo career of Phil Collins. But what was it that Tony and Mike told Steve about not being able to have a solo career while also being in Genesis? I guess we threw that rule out the window. Rutherford himself would also have a couple of hits in his solo side project, Mike and the Mechanics. If you add all these things up, you can see why Steve and Peter haven't really been too keen on a reunion. Although all the past members of Genesis have buried the hatchet, stay in touch, and even get together for documentaries and interviews, I don't believe that they will record or do a major tour together again. I would love to see that classic lineup again, but with Phil's health precluding any chance of him playing the drums like his old self again, it just wouldn't be the same anyway. So, with Steve closing the book on Genesis, at least at that point, he would double his efforts on a new solo career. His first release post-Genesis was the April 1978 release, Please Don't Touch, and rather than use the same musicians he had worked with in the past, Hackett decided to travel to Los Angeles and work with American musicians with whom he hadn't worked before. Legendary folk singer Richie Havens sang lead vocals on How Can I and Icarus Ascending. Kansas lead singer Steve Walsh would lend his voice to Racing in A, and a deleted version of the album's opening track, Narnia. The album did fairly well, reaching number 38 in the UK and 102 in the US. With the release of 1979's Spectral Mornings, Hackett started to use musicians from his live backing band on the record, and most Hackett fans consider this lineup to be Steve's classic lineup. It featured his brother John on various wind instruments, Pete Hicks on lead vocals, Dick Cadbury on bass and backing vocals, Nick Magnus on keys, and John Shearer on drums. The album again was well received, and Steve was starting to cement himself as a viable draw, both in the record sales and live show department. He wasn't going to fill a 75,000-seat arena, but he would fill the large theaters and auditoriums around the world as a known entity in the progressive rock circuit. Hackett would go on to release 1980's Defector, which most consider the best of his classic solo period. That got to number 9 on the album charts, and Steve enjoyed a sold-out tour in Europe and even was able to tour in North America for the first time as a solo artist. 1981's Cured would feature a collaboration with his keyboardist Nick Magnus and feature shorter, more pop-oriented tunes. It also would be the first time for which Steve would contribute his own vocals to the entire album. 1983's Highly Strung would be the last album Steve would complete on his old Genesis-era record label Charisma. He would go on to kick out an album later that year called Bay of Kings, which is an entire album of classical guitar pieces. In 1986, Steve would form a supergroup with ex-Yes and Asia guitarist Steve Howe for one aptly titled album called GTR, which had pretty good success and even a hit single with When the Heart Rules the Mind, which reached number 14 on the Billboard Hot 100 charts. It was a fun departure for two gods of progressive rock guitar to join up. The album is a fun listen, but just a disclaimer, it's pretty 80s and sounds more like an Asia album than a Hackett album to my ears. As the late 80s and early 90s rolled on, Steve kept putting out the albums that he wanted to make. He'd put out another album of mostly classical pieces called Momentum. He changed up his sound a bit to a darker tone for guitar noir. And in 1994, he put his stamp on the blues with his album of covers called Blues with a Feeling. But in 1996, he was getting nostalgic for the old days and decided to put out Watcher of the Skies, Genesis Revisited, in which he would re-record several Genesis standards from the old days. It featured a massive list of musicians, including both Bill Bruford and Chester Thompson, both of Genesis' touring group over the years. With Steve's willingness to again embrace the Genesis years, he was able to add this chapter of his life to his stage shows, and as more music fans were looking to experience the classic music of Genesis, and to hear those amazing guitar parts live once again is a treat that I call on all of you to experience once you get a chance. Steve has and will continue to release his own solo work throughout the years, with 2019's At the Edge of Light being Steve's 28th studio release, in addition to 11 live albums and a gaggle of other compilations and DVD releases. Steve's commercial career could be classified as steady Eddie, with Steve enjoying a devout following of fans, which has grown as he has incorporated more Genesis into his live sets, even culminating with the late 2000s run with the Genesis Revisited live show, which features a great band that really captures the feel and music of those original shows. And of course, Steve's incredible playing doesn't hurt. Steve's website says he will be back on the road in April of 2021 in Australia, and as the coronavirus problem gets more under control, we can probably expect him back in the States before we know it. I'll drop a link to his website in the description below if you're interested in catching a show. But that'll be all for this edition of Forgotten Fretmasters. Hope you enjoyed the show, and if you did, be sure to subscribe to the channel for much more content like this, and also like and comment your favorite memories of Steve. Maybe you saw him back in the 70s with Genesis. We'd love to hear about it. Thanks for watching, and we will see you next time.